The Lighthouse at Wraith's Point, a Mr. James story. It has been my practice for some years, when the opportunity presents itself, to record those experiences of colleagues and correspondents, which, though they may strain the credulity of the rational mind, bear the unmistakable stamp of sincerity. The account which follows came into my possession through circumstances both melancholy and singular. The late Mr. Philip Dunning, whose contributions to the study of 18th century coastal fortifications were not inconsiderable, left among his effects a leather-bound journal detailing his final field investigation in the autumn of 1903. His landlady at Kingsmouth, a Mrs. Pardew, forwarded the volume to me after his death, which occurred, I should note, under circumstances that the local physician attributed to a failure of the heart, though the man was but 43 years of age, and had previously enjoyed robust health. I have taken the liberty of arranging Mr. Dunning's notes into a continuous narrative, though I have altered nothing of substance. Where his entries grew fragmented, particularly toward the conclusion, I have merely supplied such connective tissue as seemed necessary for comprehension. The reader may judge for themselves what credit to extend to the following pages. I will say only this. I visited Kingsmouth myself in the spring of 1904, and while the locals proved reluctant to discuss the matter, I observed that the headland known as Wraith's Point had indeed suffered a substantial collapse during the previous winter, and that the ruins of the old lighthouse, if ruins they may be called, were now entirely submerged at high tide. What follows, then, is Philip Dunning's account, as faithful to his words as I can make it. E.C. Cambridge, May 1905, Tuesday the 17th of September, 1903. I arrived at Kingsmouth this afternoon, after a tedious journey from Norwich, the final leg of which was accomplished in a dog-cart that seemed determined to rattle every bone in my body loose from its proper moorings. The village itself is of the sort one finds scattered along this bleak stretch of the Norfolk coast, grey stone cottages hunched against the wind, a small harbour suitable for fishing smacks, and little else, and an inn of indeterminate antiquity that advertises itself as the Ship and Anchor, though neither ship nor anchor is visible in its weathered sign. Mrs. Pardew, my landlady, maintains a house on the upper street with a prospect of the sea. The accommodation is clean, if Spartan, 2 rooms on the first floor, with a sitting room overlooking the harbour, and a bedroom to the rear. Mrs. Pardew herself is a woman of perhaps 60 years, possessed of that particular reserve one encounters in these coastal communities, civil but watchful, as if weighing each word before releasing it into the world. I explained to her the purpose of my visit. I am engaged in compiling a comprehensive survey of navigational structures along the East Anglian coast for the Society, with particular attention to those lights and beacons erected during the 18th century. Wraith's Point, some 2 miles north of the village, boasted what my preliminary research suggested was a particularly fine example of the period, a lighthouse completed in 1748, operational until 1867, when a new light was established further along the coast at Cromer. The old tower, I understood, had been abandoned, but remained substantially intact. "You'll be wanting to visit the point, then," Mrs. Pardew observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Indeed, I hope to make a thorough examination of the structure. The record suggests some unusual architectural features." "Unusual?" she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Well, I suppose that's one way of putting it." I inquired whether the lighthouse was accessible, and whether any difficulties might attend a visit. "The path is clear enough, in good weather," she said, though I'd advise against going there of an evening. The fogs come in sudden-like on that headland. More than one person has lost their way." She paused, then added, "And the locals don't care much for the place. Haven't done for years." This species of rural superstition is, of course, familiar to any field researcher. I assured Mrs. Pardew that I would exercise appropriate caution, and inquired whether she knew of anyone who might have personal knowledge of the lighthouse during its operational years. "All dead now," she said flatly. "Last keeper died in '71, and that was young Tom Bastable, who only had the watching of the empty tower. The one before him—" She hesitated. "Well, that's old history." I pressed her gently, but she would say no more on the subject, busying herself instead with the preparation of my supper. I dined adequately on fish pie and retired early, as the journey had fatigued me considerably. From my window, I could see the dark line of the headland projecting into the grey sea, and even at this distance, I fancied I could make out the pale cylinder of the lighthouse tower against the darker mass of the cliff. Tomorrow, I shall walk out to examine it. Wednesday, 18th September, a clear morning, remarkable for this coast, Mrs. Pardew assures me. I set out after breakfast with my notebook, measuring tape and camera, following the cliff path northward from the village. The way proved easy enough. If somewhat exposed, the path runs perhaps 30 yards back from the cliff edge, which here rises some 150 feet above the sea. To my left, the land rolled away in fields of coarse grass and gorse. To my right, gulls wheeled and cried above the grey-green waters. The lighthouse came into view as I rounded a curve in the path. It stands, or rather stood, for I must use the past tense now, upon a projection of the headland that thrust itself boldly seaward, connected to the main body of the land by a narrow isthmus of rock, perhaps 50 yards across. The tower itself was of the cylindrical pattern common to the period, constructed of fine white stone that had weathered to a mottled grey. I estimated its height at perhaps 70 feet from the base to the lantern gallery. As I approached, certain peculiarities became apparent. The base of the tower, some 12 feet in diameter, was surrounded by a ring of worked stone blocks, forming a sort of stylobate or platform. Upon this platform, at cardinal intervals, stood 4 stone pillars, each perhaps 4 feet in height, and carved with what appeared to be maritime symbols, anchors, waves, and curious intertwined designs that might have been ropes or perhaps serpents. The pillars were badly eroded, but one could still discern a certain deliberation in their placement, as if they served some purpose beyond mere ornament. The entrance door, a heavy oak affair banded with iron, stood slightly ajar. I noted that the lock had been forced at some point recently, to judge by the bright scratches on the metal. This gave me pause, for I had no wish to intrude upon any person who might have established a claim to the place, however informal. I called out, but received no answer, save the cry of the gulls and the distant cessation of the waves below. I entered. The ground floor was a single circular chamber, perhaps 15 feet across, lit by narrow windows set deep into the thick walls. The floor was of slate, and against the far wall stood a workbench or table, upon which lay various objects in a state of considerable disorder. Rusted tools, fragments of brass mechanism, lamp parts, I presumed, and several thick ledgers bound in cracked leather. A spiral stair of iron, showing considerable corrosion, rose into the darkness above. The air within possessed a particular quality that I noted immediately. Not merely damp, which one would expect in a structure so exposed to the sea air, but possessed of a distinct smell. that I can only describe as of deep water and things long submerged. There was also, beneath this, something else, a faint odor of corruption, as of fish left too long in the sun. I attributed this to the presence of dead birds, or perhaps bats, that had found their way inside. I spent some time examining the ledgers. Two proved to be lighthouse logs, covering the years 1748 to 1752 and 1813 to 1829. The entries were of the sort one might expect: records of lamp oil consumed, notes on weather conditions, lists of ships sighted. The handwriting varied, suggesting multiple keepers over the years. One entry, dated the 14th of March, 1829, caught my attention. Fog persistent for third day. No vessels observed. The lamp burns steady, but I fancy it draws answers from the sea that are no business of Christian men. J.M. advises, I should not watch the water when the light is lit, but what else is a keeper to do? The thing I saw last evening in the reflection of the glass troubles me still. The entry was signed T. Pike, and no subsequent entries appeared in that volume. I made a note to research this Pike and his sudden cessation of record keeping. The third ledger was stranger still. It appeared to be not an official log, but a personal journal, and the hand suggested an earlier period, perhaps mid-18th century. Many entries had been damaged by damp, the ink bleeding into illegibility, but I was able to make out fragments. The old folk say the point was named for what walks here when the sea fog comes. Foolishness, yet I confess. 3 nights. Now I have heard the bell, though the buoy was removed 6 months past. Something moves in the lamp room after midnight. Footsteps on the gallery, but when I look, and most unsettling, the light draws them, I think. Or perhaps it is the light they seek to tend, having forgotten they are no longer. The entry concluded with several lines that had been violently scored through, as if the writer had thought better of recording whatever observation he had been about to make. I will confess that these fragments affected me more than they perhaps should have done. There is something peculiarly disturbing about encountering evidence of another's fear, preserved in their own hand across the gulf of years. Still, I reminded myself that lighthouse keepers were often solitary men, prone to melancholy and imaginative fancy during long watches. The isolation of such a post would weigh upon any mind. I photographed the ledgers and examined the mechanisms on the table, pieces of the original lamp apparatus. I judged of the oil-burning pattern that preceded the later argand burners. Then I ascended the iron stair. The steps were slick with something I first took for moisture, but which, upon closer inspection, appeared to be a thin coating of some organic matter, perhaps algae or marine growth, though how such material could flourish here, 60 feet above the sea, I could not imagine. The smell grew stronger as I climbed, that odor of deep water and decay. I counted 3 levels, a keeper's room on the first floor, empty save for a rusted bed frame and a toppled chair, a watch room on the second, bare walls and broken glass underfoot, and finally the lantern chamber itself. I emerged into a circular room, perhaps 8 feet in diameter, surrounded by large panes of glass, set in heavy iron frames. The lamp assembly had been removed, leaving only the circular mounting plate in the center of the floor, but it was the atmosphere of the place that arrested me. Despite the broken panes, several were missing entirely. The air seemed curiously still and close, and there was light, not the gray daylight filtering through the glass, but something else, a faint phosphorescence that seemed to cling to the metal fixtures and the interior surfaces of the remaining window panes. It put me in mind of the luminescence one sometimes observes in seawater disturbed at night, that cold fire of marine organisms. I approached the seaward window and looked out across the iron gallery that surrounded the lantern room. The view was spectacular, if vertiginous. The sea spread before me in all directions, the coast curving away to north and south. Directly below, the waves churned white against the base of the cliff. And there, on the gallery rail, I observed something that gave me considerable pause. A wet handprint, the fingers clearly articulated, as if someone had gripped the iron rail with a dripping hand. I touched it cautiously. The moisture was cold, colder than seemed natural, and possessed of a viscosity like seawater, but more clinging. I drew my hand back and wiped it on my handkerchief with a feeling of instinctive revulsion. I descended more rapidly than I had climbed, suddenly eager for the open air and sunlight. As I reached the ground floor, I thought I heard, but no, it was certainly my imagination, or perhaps the wind. A sound from above, a slow metallic creak, as of someone ascending the iron stair. I did not pause to investigate, but passed quickly through the door and into the daylight. It was only when I had walked some distance back along the path that I felt my composure return. The sun was warm, the breeze fresh, and the lighthouse, seen from this remove, appeared merely a picturesque ruin, nothing more. I chided myself for allowing the fragmentary ravings of long-dead keepers to unsettle my nerves. Nevertheless, I found myself glancing back more than once as I walked, and I was conscious of a certain relief when a curve in the path placed the tower out of sight. Mrs. Pardew served a late luncheon upon my return. I mentioned my visit to the lighthouse, and she listened with that same careful attention I had noted before. "You went inside then," she said. "I did. A fascinating structure, if somewhat deteriorated. Find anything particular?" I described the ledges and the curious maritime carvings at the base. She nodded slowly. "Those stones are old, older than the lighthouse. Some say they were there before, on the point, and the builders incorporated them into the new structure. Whether that was wise," she left the thought unfinished. "Surely you don't credit the superstitions about the place?" I said, attempting a tone of light inquiry. "I don't know what I credit," she replied, "but I know that keepers at that light had a habit of not finishing their tenure. The service records would show that, if you cared to look, men would request transfer or simply fail to arrive for their rotation. And the last one," she paused, "well, he's the reason the light was abandoned. Truth be told, the last keeper, I understood the lighthouse was decommissioned in 1867. Officially, perhaps, but someone had to mind it until the new light was fully operational, keep vandals away, and such. That was Arthur Gulliver. Took up residence there in the spring of '67. By autumn, he was dead." "An accident?" "They found him in the lantern room, drowned." I must have looked my incomprehension, for she continued, "Drowned, Mr. Dunning, his lungs full of seawater, though the nearest wave was 100 feet below. The inquest couldn't explain it. Some said he'd gone mad and thrown himself from the cliff, only to be carried back up by some freak of the current. But that doesn't explain why his body was dry on the outside, nor why his hands were frozen to the lamp mechanism, nor why—" She stopped herself. "Well, it's old history," as I said. I thanked her for the information and withdrew to my sitting room to write up my notes. As I worked, the light faded outside my window, and I observed the fog beginning to roll in from the sea, those banks of vapor that are such a feature of this coast. By the time I set down my pen, the village below had disappeared into white obscurity, and the warning horn at the harbor mouth had begun its mournful bellowing. I found myself thinking of Arthur Gulliver, tending his obsolete light on that lonely headland, watching the fog close in night after night. What had he seen in those long watches? What had driven him to his inexplicable end? It is foolish, I know, to allow such thoughts to take hold. Yet as I write this, long after Mrs. Pardew has retired, and the house has fallen silent around me, I confess that I strain my ears for sounds that I hope not to hear. The distant tolling of a bell where no bell should be, or perhaps slow footsteps on an iron stair. The fog presses against my window like a living thing, and I shall be glad when morning comes. Thursday, the 19th of September. The fog persisted through the night and showed no sign of lifting by morning. Mrs. Pardew advised against any expedition to the point, and I was content to spend the day in the village, making inquiries and examining such local records as were available. The parish church of St. Aidan's proved a useful resource. The verger, a Mr. Clem, granted me access to the registry and to certain other documents preserved in the church's small archive. The records confirmed Mrs. Pardew's account. Arthur Gulliver, aged 38, keeper of the Wraith's Point Light, was interred in the churchyard on the 3rd of October, 1867. The burial register noted the cause of death as asphyxiation by drowning, circumstances uncertain. I found the grave itself in the newer section of the yard, a simple headstone, much weathered, bearing only name and dates. Someone, within the past year, to judge by the withered stems, had left flowers there. More interesting were the earlier records. I traced the succession of keepers at Wraith's Point from the Lighthouse's opening in 1748. The pattern Mrs. Pardew had mentioned was indeed apparent. Tenures were typically short, rarely exceeding 2 years. The turnover was remarkable, even accounting for the isolated nature of the post. Several entries noted simply resigned his post or accepted alternative placement. One, dated 1783, recorded that a keeper named William Marsh had abandoned his situation without notice or explanation. But it was in a bundle of correspondence, tied with faded ribbon and marked Lighthouse Service, various, that I found the most illuminating material. The letters dated from the 1820s and concerned complaints lodged by successive keepers at Wraith's Point. I transcribe portions here. The sounds that disturb my rest are not natural to any structure I have previously inhabited. They come from the lantern room. After the lamp is extinguished, a slow, regular tread, as of someone keeping watch there. Though I have climbed the stair on many occasions and found the chamber empty, respectfully request transfer to any other station. My predecessor made certain notations in the logbook which I initially dismissed as fancy, but I now believe that Mr. Pike's observations were founded in experience rather than imagination. There is something about the place that is not right. The figure I observed on the gallery 3 nights past, I initially believed it to be an intruder, though how any person might have gained access to the tower without my knowledge I could not fathom. When I took up my lamp to investigate, I found the gallery empty, though the iron rail was wet, as if someone had lately gripped it with hands dipped in the sea. The correspondence concluded with a curt response from the Lighthouse Board declining to authorize any transfers and advising the keepers to maintain a rational disposition and attend to their duties without indulging in fanciful speculation. I spent the remainder of the afternoon in my rooms, attempting to construct a coherent narrative from these fragments. The obvious explanation that Wraith's Point had acquired a reputation for being haunted and that subsequent keepers had been influenced by this reputation to misinterpret ordinary phenomena, satisfied me intellectually, yet failed to account for certain stubborn facts. The wet handprints, for instance, the smell of seawater and decay in a structure open to the air, and most troubling, the manner of Arthur Gulliver's death. By early evening, the fog had begun to break up, though it still clung to the lower ground. I stood at my window, watching the vapor shift and billow in the gathering dusk, and became aware that something was visible on the headland to the north. At first, I thought it merely a trick of the eye, a reflection, or perhaps a peculiar quality of the fading light. But as I watched, I became certain there was a light at Wraith's Point, faint but unmistakable, emanating from the height where the old lighthouse lantern room stood. I confess this sight affected me considerably. I knew, or thought I knew, that the lighthouse had been decommissioned decades ago, its lamp dismantled and removed. Yet there could be no mistaking what I saw: a pale, cold radiance, not steady, but flickering slightly, as if a lamp were burning in that long, dark tower. I remained at the window for perhaps a quarter of an hour, during which time the light persisted. Then, quite suddenly, it vanished, as if extinguished by a hand. The darkness that followed seemed deeper for its absence. When I mentioned the matter to Mrs. Pardew at supper, her response was curious. "That's been seen before," she said, "more times than I could count. Sometimes when the fog's in, sometimes on clear nights. No one goes to investigate anymore. But surely someone must have examined the lighthouse to determine the cause." "Oh, they've been out there. The constable, various officials over the years. They find nothing. No lamp, no fuel, no explanation. The light just appears." She set down a plate of boiled mutton with rather more force than necessary. "If you've any sense, Mr. Dunning, you'll complete your survey from a distance and leave the point to whatever keeps watch there." "You believe the lighthouse is haunted, then?" I attempted to keep my tone neutral, merely curious. She looked at me directly. "I believe that there are places in this world where the past doesn't stay properly buried. I believe that some lights, once lit, don't fully go out. And I believe that Arthur Gulliver died because he insisted on understanding what would have been better left alone." She gathered up her tray. The same could be said of any man who pries too deeply into matters that don't concern him. With that pointed observation, she withdrew, leaving me to my increasingly unquiet thoughts. I find myself in a peculiar position. My scholarly instincts insist that there must be a rational explanation for these phenomena, some confluence of natural causes producing effects that merely appear supernatural. Yet another part of my mind, a part I am reluctant to acknowledge, whispers that I have stumbled upon something genuinely anomalous, something that resists rational categorization. Tomorrow, I intend to return to the lighthouse for a more thorough investigation. I will examine the lantern room in detail, determine if any mechanism remains that could produce light, and document every aspect of the structure's present condition. If there is a natural explanation, I shall discover it. As I write this, the village is quiet, and the fog has cleared entirely. The moon, nearly full, illuminates the sea with a cold phosphorescence. I can see the headland from my window, a dark mass against the slightly lighter sky. The lighthouse is invisible at this distance, but I know it is there, standing at the point where land meets sea, keeping its silent watch. And I wonder, though I tell myself it is merely fancy, whether something in that tower looks back toward the village, waiting for the next curious soul to venture too close to the truth. Friday, The 20th of September. I was awakened in the night. I cannot say at what hour, by a sound that penetrated my sleep and brought me abruptly to consciousness. It was a bell, tolling slowly and clearly, the sound carrying across the water with that peculiar clarity that sound sometimes achieves in the deep hours. I lay in my bed, listening, counting the strokes, 12 in all, before silence resumed. The church clock of St. Aidan's keeps no such hour. It strikes only on the hour and half hour, and its bell has a deeper bronze quality, quite unlike what I had heard. This was higher pitched, with a maritime quality to it, like a bell buoy swaying in a long swell. I rose and went to the window. The night was clear, the moonlight bright enough to distinguish the headland and the pale cylinder of the lighthouse. No light showed there, yet as I watched, I became aware of movement on the path along the cliff, a dark figure, indistinct at this distance, making its way toward Wraith's Point. I watched for perhaps 5 minutes, but the figure did not emerge from the direction of the lighthouse, nor did I see it return. It simply disappeared, swallowed by the darkness near the base of the tower. I did not sleep again that night. By morning I had determined my course of action. I would make one final, thorough investigation of the lighthouse, documenting everything with scientific precision. If Mrs. Pardew's warnings proved correct, and there was something genuinely amiss, then I would have the evidence to support a report to the society. If, as I still half believed, the phenomena had natural explanations, then I would have laid the local superstitions to rest with facts and observation. I set out mid-morning under clear skies, carrying not only my camera and notebook, but also a portable electric torch, a recent acquisition of which I was rather proud, and several candles. The path seemed more forbidding in daylight than it had on my first visit, though I attributed this to my heightened state of alertness rather than any objective change in the environment. The lighthouse appeared as before, grey and stolid against the sea. Yet as I approached, I observed something I had not noticed previously, a worn track in the earth leading around the base of the tower, a footpath barely distinguishable from the surrounding ground. I followed it, and on the seaward side of the structure, I discovered a narrow cleft in the rock face descending toward the water. A series of crude steps had been cut into the stone, very old by the look of them, and much weathered by salt spray. I descended cautiously. The steps were treacherous, slick with moss and sea slime, but they led to a small platform, or ledge perhaps 20 feet above the current waterline. Here at the base of the cliff, I found something unexpected, an opening in the rock, partly natural, partly worked by human hands. It was low. I would have to crouch to enter, and pitch dark beyond the first few feet. I hesitated. The opening breathed out air that was dank and cold, carrying that same odor I had smelled in the lighthouse, deep water and organic decay. My instincts urged me to retreat, to climb back up to the path and continue my investigation above ground. Yet I am not a man easily deterred from inquiry, and I reasoned that this cave or passage might provide the key to understanding the lighthouse's reputation. Perhaps it connected to the tower above, providing access for smugglers or wreckers in earlier times. Perhaps its echoing chambers produced the sounds that had unnerved previous keepers. I lit my electric torch and entered. The passage proved to be a natural fissure in the rock, high enough after the first few yards to allow me to stand upright. The walls glistened with moisture and were encrusted with barnacles and other marine growth far above the reach of any tide I could imagine. The smell grew stronger as I proceeded, and I became aware of a distant sound, a regular, rhythmic susurration, like breathing or like waves, heard through a great thickness of stone. After perhaps 50 yards, the passage widened into a chamber of considerable extent. My torch beam could not reach the far walls, but it illuminated a scene that arrested me entirely. The chamber floor was wet, covered with perhaps an inch of standing seawater that reflected my light in broken ripples, and in this water, arranged in a rough circle, stood a series of stone blocks, the same weathered, carved stones I had seen at the base of the lighthouse above. They were covered with the same maritime symbols, anchors, waves, and those curious intertwined designs. But here, where they had been protected from weathering, the carvings were clearer, and I could see that they represented not ropes or serpents, but rather human figures, arms linked, bodies merging with the waves, faces turned upward toward what? The surface, the sky, something beyond sight. In the center of the circle lay a dark opening, perhaps 6 feet across, filled with black water that stirred with some motion other than that of the water surrounding it. As I watched, frozen by a fascination I cannot adequately explain, something pale broke the surface for an instant, an arm, I thought, or something like an arm, before subtracting again into the darkness with barely a ripple. The smell was overpowering now. I felt a sudden wave of nausea and dizziness, as if the air itself had become thick and unwholesome, and from somewhere deeper in the cave system, from the dark water perhaps, or from passages I could not see, I heard that sound again, slow, regular footsteps, the tread of something walking on stone, coming closer. I will not claim that my retreat was dignified. I turned and scrambled back along the passage, my torch beam swinging wildly, my breath coming in gasps. I emerged onto the ledge, climbed the steps with more haste than care, and did not stop until I stood once more on the path above, the fresh air of the headland filling my lungs. I remained there for some minutes, allowing my racing heart to slow. The sea stretched away to the horizon, innocent and grey. Behind me, the lighthouse stood silent. Nothing moved on the headland, save the grass stirring in the wind. Yet I could not forget what I had seen, or thought I had seen, in that subterranean chamber. The carved stones, the dark water, the pale thing that might have been a hand reaching up from unguessable depths. I climbed the tower with a sense not of curiosity now, but of grim necessity. Whatever haunted Wraith's point, I was convinced, had its origin in the connection between that sea cave below and the lighthouse above. The mystery lay in understanding what the original builders had known or feared, and why they had incorporated those ancient stones into their new structure. The ground floor of the lighthouse offered nothing new. The ledges lay as I had left them. The tools and brass mechanism parts remained undisturbed, but as I climbed the iron stair to the upper levels, I became aware of a change in the atmosphere. The air seemed denser, as if charged with some invisible energy. My skin prickled, and I smelled quite distinctly now, not merely seawater but something else, ozone, like the smell before a thunderstorm, or perhaps like the odor of certain electrical apparatus when operating under high voltage. I reached the lantern room and stopped. The circular plate in the center of the floor, the mounting point for the long-removed lamp assembly, was no longer empty. Upon it rested what appeared to be the ghost or impression of a lamp, a translucent shape, barely visible in the daylight, that flickered with a faint cold radiance like marsh light or the luminescence of decaying fish. It possessed no substance that I could determine. My torch beam passed through it without hindrance, yet it was undeniably present, and it seemed to pulse with a slow rhythm, like a heartbeat, or like waves breaking upon a distant shore. I approached cautiously. The temperature dropped as I drew near. I could see my breath misting in the air, and in the glass panes surrounding the lantern room, even in those that were cracked or missing, I could see reflected not the landscape outside but something else, a dark sea under a darker sky, and shapes moving in that sea, pale forms that broke the surface and sank again, always circling, always rising and subsiding, as if in response to some unheard summons. I am not ashamed to say that I fled. I descended the tower in a controlled panic, burst through the door, and did not stop until I had gained the path and walked far enough that the lighthouse was out of sight behind the curve of the headland. Only then did I allow myself to stop, to breathe, to attempt to impose some rational framework upon what I had witnessed. I failed. The sun was westering as I trudged back toward Kingsmouth. I did not look behind me, yet I was conscious, with a certainty that defied reason, that I was observed, that something in that tower watched my retreat with an attention that was patient, unwavering, and profoundly inhuman. Friday, the 20th of September. I returned to Mrs. Pardew's house in a state of considerable agitation. She took one look at my face and sat me down in the parlor with a generous measure of brandy, for which I was grateful. "You went back," she said. It was not a question. I nodded, unable yet to form coherent sentences. "And you saw it." "I saw something. I don't know what I saw." She settled into the chair opposite, her hands folded in her lap, and regarded me with an expression that mixed sympathy with a certain grim satisfaction, as if I had confirmed something she had long suspected. "You're not the first," she said, "and those who've seen what you've seen rarely speak of it clearly. The mind won't quite hold on to it, you see, like trying to remember a dream." "There's a cave," I began, "beneath the lighthouse, and stones, and water that moves wrongly." "I know about the cave. Most folk do, though few have been inside. It was there long before the lighthouse. The old stories say it's a mouth, an opening into the deep places of the sea, and what comes up through it." She paused. "Well, what comes up through it isn't meant for daylight or Christian company." Despite my shaken state, the scholar in me asserted itself. "You're suggesting that the lighthouse was built as some kind of containment, a way of sealing or controlling whatever exists in that cave." "Not sealing. Tending." She leaned forward slightly. "The stones you saw in the cave and around the lighthouse base, they're older than any structure in these parts. Some say they date to the time when people first came to this coast. They're markers, or wards, or maybe," she struggled for the word, "maybe they're an agreement, a compact. Someone or something must keep watch, must tend the light, must observe the old ways, and in exchange, what lives in the deep water stays there, mostly." "That's absurd," I said, though my protest lacked conviction. "You're describing a pre-Christian ritual, a superstition that somehow persisted into the 18th century and influenced the construction of a modern lighthouse." "I'm describing what is," she replied simply. "The Trinity House Board didn't build that lighthouse where it stands by chance. They knew about the point, about its reputation, and whether they believed or not, they built according to the old pattern, the stones in their circle, the tower at the center, the light above the dark water. They made it fit the older shape. And the keepers, they tend the watch, whether they understand why or not. Most manage for a time. Some flee. A few, she hesitated, a few stay too long. They begin to understand things that men aren't meant to understand. They see what's in the water when the light reflects it, and they hear what calls from the depths when the fog comes in. And eventually, they become part of what they've been watching, like Arthur Gulliver. You're saying he didn't die by accident. I'm saying he drowned on dry land because he'd spent too many nights looking into water that looks back, because he'd breathed too much of the air that rises from that cave, because he'd heard his name spoken in a voice like waves on shingle, and he answered. She stood, gathering her composure. The light you saw burning, the one that shouldn't exist, that's his light now. He's there still, keeping his watch, because he can't leave, won't leave. Whatever claimed him won't let him go. I sat in silence, attempting to process this extraordinary narrative. Every rational instinct rejected it as folklore, superstition, the sort of peasant mythology that anthropologists document with detached amusement. Yet I had seen the phantom lamp. I had felt the presence in that tower, and I could not explain, could not even properly remember what I had glimpsed in the cave below. What should I do? I heard myself ask. Mrs. Pardew regarded me gravely. Leave tomorrow. If you can, write your report from your notes and drawings, but don't go back to that tower. Some knowledge isn't worth the having. I'm not sure I can do that. I'm a scholar. I can't simply ignore evidence of something genuinely anomalous, something that challenges our understanding of what? The natural world? Mr. Dunning, there's nothing natural about Wraith's Point. There never has been, and men who insist on understanding every mystery end up like Arthur, Gulliver, drowned in air, trapped in a place between sea and sky, keeping a watch that never ends. She left me then to my brandy and my thoughts. I write this entry in my room as the light fades outside. The fog is returning, rolling in from the sea in great banks of vapor. I can hear the harbor horn beginning its evening lament, and if I strain my ears, though I tell myself I am imagining it, I can hear another sound beneath the horn, a bell tolling out on the headland, slow and rhythmic, 12 strokes, and then silence. I have decided that I must return to the lighthouse once more, not tomorrow, when fear might prevent me, but tonight, while my resolve holds. I must document what I can, attempt to understand what I have encountered, and then, as Mrs. Pardew advises, depart this place and its mysteries. I am aware that this may be foolish. I am aware that wiser men than I have fled from less, but I cannot abandon an investigation incomplete, cannot turn my back on a phenomenon that, if genuine, challenges every materialist assumption of modern science. I shall wait until full dark, when the tide is low and the fog is thick. I shall bring my camera, my notebook, and my electric torch, and I shall, God willing, return before dawn to set down my final observations. If I do not return, this journal will serve as my account and my warning. Friday, the 20th of September night. I am writing this by electric torch in the ground floor chamber of the lighthouse. The time, I believe, is near midnight, though I cannot be certain. My watch appears to have stopped, the hands frozen at 10:40, though I know several hours have passed since I consulted it last. I arrived at the tower perhaps 2 hours ago. The walk along the cliff path in darkness and fog was challenging but not impossible. The moon, though obscured by vapor, provided sufficient diffuse light to keep to the trail. The lighthouse was visible only when I was nearly upon it, materializing from the fog like a ship from empty sea. The door stood open. As I had left it, I entered and lit several candles in addition to my electric torch. I had some notion that multiple light sources might prove useful. The ground floor appeared exactly as I had seen it earlier, the ledgers and tools undisturbed, but the atmosphere had changed. The smell was stronger, that odor of deep water and decay, and there was sound, not the creaking of old timbers or the whisper of wind, but a low rhythmic vibration, as if some great machinery operated far below, its pulse transmitted through the stone. I should have climbed the tower then. That had been my intention, to reach the lantern room, to photograph the phantom lamp if it appeared, to document whatever I could observe, but something drew me, instead, to the seaward window, and I looked out into the fog-shrouded darkness, toward where I knew the sea lay, and I saw lights, not the phantom light of the lighthouse. These were distant, mobile, multiple. They moved on, or just above the water, pale and cold like corpse candles, describing patterns that were almost, but not quite random. As I watched, they seemed to draw closer, or perhaps my perception of distance in the fog was unreliable. I counted 12, then 20, then lost count, as they wove and circled in their silent dance. It was then that I heard the footsteps. They began above, in the lantern room, a slow, measured tread on the iron floor, circling, as a keeper might circle the lamp during his watch. Then they began to descend. The sound was quite clear, even above the rhythmic pulse from below. Step, step, step down the spiral stair, with that particular ring of boot heels on iron that is unmistakable. I confess, I was paralyzed. I stood at the window, my torch wavering in my grip, watching the fog and the distant lights, while those footsteps descended with mechanical regularity, past the watchroom, past the keeper's quarters, down to the ground floor where I stood. They stopped. The door to the stairwell remained empty, yet I knew, with a certainty that transcended any merely sensory perception, that something stood there, just beyond the radius of my candlelight, something that had descended from above, something that now observed me with an attention that was patient and utterly implacable. I forced myself to turn, to direct my electric torch toward the stairwell. The figure that stood there was not entirely of this world. It possessed form, but not substance, or perhaps substance of a sort that my eyes could not properly resolve. It was the shape of a man, tall and stooped, wearing what might have been a keeper's uniform of oilcloth and wool, but the details shifted and blurred as I watched, like a reflection in troubled water. Where the face should have been, there was only darkness shot through with pale lights, like the phosphorescence of deep-sea creatures, and it was wet. Water ran from its form in rivulets, pooling on the slate floor, though the figure itself seemed not to diminish or grow less distinct. It did not approach. It simply stood, as if waiting, and from somewhere, from the cave below perhaps, or from the tower above, or from the figure itself, I heard a sound like speech, not words exactly, but a rhythm and cadence that suggested communication. It rose and fell, like waves upon shingle, and within it, I thought I could distinguish my own name. Dunning. I cannot say how long we remained thus, the dead keeper and I, in that chamber, lit by candles and torch, and by the faint phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the figure itself. Minutes, certainly, perhaps longer. I had no sense of time passing, only of a weight pressing down upon me, an expectation or demand that I could not quite grasp. And then I understood. It wanted me to climb, to ascend to the lantern room, to take up the watch that Arthur Gulliver had abandoned, or rather had never truly abandoned, being still trapped in the endless repetition of his final duty. The realization broke the paralysis that had held me. I am not a brave man. I believe I have made that clear, but I am obstinate, and I will not be compelled by anything, living or dead, to surrender my will. I shook my head, a simple human gesture of refusal, and said aloud, "No." The effect was immediate. The figure seemed to draw back, or perhaps to become less solid, its form wavering like heat shimmer. The sound that was like speech rose in volume and urgency, becoming almost a wail, and from above, in the lantern room, a light blazed forth, not the cold phantom glow I had seen earlier, but something brilliant and terrible, a light that pierced the fog and the darkness with a radiance like lightning frozen in time. I ran. I crashed through the door and out into the fog, stumbling across the stone platform, nearly colliding with the carved pillars at the lighthouse base. Behind me, that light continued to blaze, and I heard or felt the structure itself beginning to respond to some terrible pressure, a groaning of stone and iron, as if the tower were being wrenched from its foundations. I gained the path and fled into the darkness. The fog was so thick I could barely see 3 yards ahead, but I knew the way by instinct, by counting steps, by following the slope of the land. I did not look back. I did not slow until I was halfway to the village, until the lighthouse was lost in the fog and distance behind me. Only then did I stop, gasping, and chance a glance over my shoulder. The light at Wraith's Point still burned, but it was changing. The brilliant glare was fading, replaced by something else, a cold blue radiance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the waves. I could hear but not see breaking on the cliffs below, and around that light, visible even through the fog, other lights gathered, those same corpse candles I had seen dancing on the water. They spiraled up around the tower, circling it like moths around a flame, rising higher and higher until they merged with the beacon at the summit. Then, quite suddenly, all light ceased. The darkness that followed was absolute. I am back now in Mrs. Pardew's house, in my room, writing by torchlight, my candles I left behind in the lighthouse, still burning for all I know. My clothes are soaked, though I cannot say whether from the fog or from my own perspiration. My hands shake as I write, and I am conscious that something has changed in me, some fundamental alteration in how I perceive the world and my place in it. I have encountered the numinous, the genuinely other, and I am diminished by the experience. All my scholarly certainty, my rationalist assumptions, seem now like so many paper walls erected against a vast and indifferent darkness. There are things in this world, things beneath it and beyond it, that care nothing for human comprehension, that operate according to laws and purposes we cannot fathom. The lighthouse at Wraith's Point is such a thing. It is a threshold, a place where the barriers between our world and some other place wear thin, and what keeps watch there, what has always kept watch there, since long before any lighthouse was built, requires tending, requires acknowledgement, demands its keepers whether they come willingly or not. Arthur Gulliver was not the first to be claimed. I do not believe he will be the last. As for my own fate, I remain uncertain. I refused the summons. I fled. Whether that will be sufficient, whether what haunts that tower will accept my refusal, or whether it will pursue, I do not know. I can only wait for morning and hope that the light of day will bring some measure of protection, or at least clarity. Outside my window, the fog presses close. Somewhere in the village, a dog is barking, a frantic, frightened sound, and beneath all other sounds, barely audible, I hear it still, the tolling of a bell where no bell should be. 12 strokes marking an hour that exists only in the liminal spaces between sea and sky, between life and whatever lies beyond. I shall not sleep tonight. Saturday, the 21st of September. Dawn brought no comfort. I descended to the parlor to find Mrs. Pardew already awake, her face drawn with worry. "You went," she said. "I heard you leave, heard you return. You're a damned fool, Mr. Dunning." I could not dispute the assessment. I recounted what I had witnessed, though the telling seemed to strip the experience of its immediate terror, reducing it to mere words that failed to convey the profound wrongness of the encounter. She listened without interruption, her expression growing graver. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. "You refused it," she said finally. "That's something, but whether it's enough," she shook her head. "I don't know. You've drawn its attention now. That much is certain, and attention once drawn is not easily diverted. What do you suggest I do?" "Leave today. Now if you can. The morning train doesn't depart until 1 o'clock. Then stay indoors. Until then, don't go near the windows overlooking the point. Don't—" She stopped abruptly, her gaze going past me to the window behind. I turned. The fog had lifted with the dawn, and the headland was clearly visible. The lighthouse stood, as it had always stood, grey and stolid against the morning sky. But something was wrong, even at this distance, even to my untrained eye. The structure appeared different. The stones seemed darker, as if scorched. The iron gallery around the lantern room had a twisted quality, though I could not be certain from this distance. "Is it still standing?" Mrs. Pardew asked quietly. "I had thought, after what you described, it appears intact, though altered perhaps." We stood together, watching the distant tower. The sea was calm, reflecting the grey sky. Nothing moved on the headland save the gulls, wheeling and crying as they always did. It might have been any ordinary morning on the coast, save for the knowledge of what stood upon that point, and what kept watch within it. "There's something you should see," Mrs. Pardew said abruptly. "Wait here." She returned a moment later with a small tin box, much battered. Opening it, she withdrew a photograph, yellowed and cracked with age. It showed a group of men standing before the lighthouse keepers, presumably from their dress and the oilcloth coats they wore. The photograph was of good quality despite its age, and the faces were clearly visible. "That was taken in 1866, Mrs. Pardew said. "The last year the light was regularly manned. The tall one there, on the left. That's Arthur Gulliver." I looked. The man in question was indeed tall, with a stooped posture and a gaunt face beneath his keeper's cap. The figure was unremarkable, save for one detail. Unlike the other men in the photograph, whose gazes were fixed on the camera, Gulliver's attention seemed directed elsewhere, toward the sea visible in the background, and his eyes, though it might have been a trick of the early photographic process, appeared oddly reflective, almost luminous. "Keep looking," Mrs. Pardew instructed. I did, and then I saw it behind the group of keepers. Just visible through one of the lighthouse's lower windows was a shadowed interior, and in that shadow a figure stood, indistinct, barely visible, but present nonetheless. A figure that should not have been there, that could not have been there, for all the keepers were accounted for in the foreground. That photograph has bothered me since I first saw it," Mrs. Pardew said softly. "Because I knew Arthur Gulliver, knew him before he took the keeper's post. He was an ordinary man, Mr. Dunning, unremarkable in every way. But after 6 months at that lighthouse, he changed, became distant, would stand for hours looking out to sea, even when off duty, and he spoke of things." She paused. "He said he could hear the stones singing beneath the tower, said there were names written in the waves that broke on the cliff, said the light, when he tended it, showed him places that weren't on any chart. He went mad. Perhaps, or perhaps, he saw too clearly. Perhaps he began to understand what that place truly was, and what it wanted, and when they found him dead in the lantern room, when they found him drowned on dry land," she took back the photograph, "they never understood that he hadn't died. Not really. Death, in the ordinary sense, doesn't apply to those who become part of the watch. They persist, they continue, and they call to others, because the watch must be maintained." A horrible thought occurred to me. The others in this photograph, all dead, some by natural causes, some by accident, 2 by drowning, though neither was anywhere near water when it happened. She replaced the photograph in its tin. "The watch calls Mr. Dunning, and sooner or later, it's answered." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You think it will call to me?" "I think you've been marked. I think you've entered that tower and breathed its air and seen its light, and that's changed you in ways you may not yet perceive. Whether you can escape that." She shrugged helplessly. "I don't know, but I know that leaving Kingsmouth is your best chance." The morning passed with agonizing slowness. I packed my belongings and attempted to occupy myself with writing up my notes, but I found concentration impossible. My attention kept returning to the window, to the view of the headland, to the lighthouse standing solitary against the sea. At 12:30, Mrs. Pardew knocked on my door to inform me that the cart would be ready to convey me to the station in 15 minutes. I thanked her and took a final look around the room that had been my lodging for less than a week that had transformed my understanding of the world in ways I was still struggling to comprehend. As I turned from the window, my eye fell upon something I had not noticed before, a damp mark on the floorboards near the foot of my bed, just visible in the afternoon light. It was the shape of a footprint, quite distinct, as if someone had stood there with wet shoes while I slept. But I had not gone out in the night, had not walked through water, and the print I observed with mounting horror had the particular pattern of a keeper's boot, with heavy treads and reinforced heel. Something had visited me in the darkness, had stood beside my sleeping form, had observed me with whatever passed for eyes in that dripping, indistinct face. I left the room without looking back. The cart carried me through the village toward the station. We passed the churchyard where Arthur Gulliver lay buried, past the harbour where fishing boats rode at anchor, past the last cottages, and out into the open country. And all the while, I was conscious of a pulling, a drawing, as if something invisible tethered me to the headland behind us. At the station, I purchased my ticket and settled onto a bench to wait. The platform was quiet. Only 2 other passengers, both elderly locals, who eyed me with that particular suspicion rural communities reserve for outsiders. 15 minutes until the train. 15 minutes until I would be carried away from this place and its mysteries. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing thoughts, and in that darkness, I heard it faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from 2 miles distant, the sound of a bell tolling slowly across the water. 12 strokes, always 12. When I opened my eyes, One of the old men was staring at me. "You heard it," he said. It was not a question. I nodded mutely. "Then you're marked," he said with grim certainty. "The point's taken notice of you. Best pray it loses interest." Or, he didn't finish the thought, turning away to scan the horizon for the approaching train. The train arrived at last, and I boarded with profound relief. I found a compartment to myself, stowed my bags, and settled by the window as the engine began to gather steam. The platform slid past, then the station building, then the open fields and hedgerows of the countryside. I should have felt relief, should have felt the tension easing, as each mile carried me farther from Kingsmouth and its haunted headland. Instead, I felt only a deepening unease, a certainty that distance meant nothing to what I had encountered. As the train rounded a curve, I caught a final glimpse of the coast. The sea was grey under grey sky, and on a headland that might have been Wraith's Point, a pale tower stood stark against the darker land, and at its summit, visible even at this distance, a light was burning, cold and blue and patient, a beacon calling to something that moved beneath the waves, or perhaps calling to me. The train carried me south and east toward Norwich and civilization, but I brought with me a knowledge I had not sought and did not want, the knowledge that there are places in this world where the natural and the supernatural intersect, where ancient compacts persist, where the dead do not rest but continue their appointed tasks in perpetuity. And I brought with me, I fear, a connection to such a place, a thread that bound me to Wraith's Point, and to whatever kept watch there, a thread that distance alone could not sever. The preceding account concludes Philip Dunning's journal. The final entry is dated Saturday, the 21st of September, 1903, and was presumably written during his train journey from Kingsmouth. The remainder of the journal contains only blank pages, save for a single notation on the final leaf, written in a hand that differs markedly from Dunning's usual script, more hurried, less controlled. It followed me, even here, even now. I hear it on the stairs at night, that slow tread, those wet footsteps. I see it in reflections, in windows, in mirrors, in standing water. Always the same figure, tall, stooped, indistinct, always watching, always waiting. The doctors say there is nothing wrong with me, that my symptoms are purely nervous in origin, but I know better. I refused the watch, and now the watch refuses to release me. This notation is dated the 3rd of December, 1903. Philip Dunning was found dead in his rooms in Norwich on the morning of December 4th. The inquest returned a verdict of death by misadventure, noting that the deceased had apparently drowned in his bath, despite the water having been only a few inches deep. The coroner's report mentioned certain peculiar findings. The deceased's lungs were found to contain seawater of a salinity suggesting deep ocean rather than domestic supply, and his hands bore marks suggesting prolonged immersion, though he had been dead no more than a few hours when discovered. Among his effects was found a considerable quantity of correspondence, much of it concerning his investigation at Kingsmouth. One letter, however, stood out. It was addressed to Dunning, but bore no postage or marking, as if it had been delivered by hand. The paper was of poor quality, much stained and damaged, as if by damp. The message, written in an uncertain hand, read simply, "The watch must be kept. Those who see the light must tend it. Those who refuse must answer. Still, come home to Wraith's Point. The beacon burns for you." The letter was unsigned. I made my own visit to Kingsmouth in the spring of 1904, as I have mentioned. The lighthouse at Wraith's Point was by then a complete ruin, the winter storms, having accomplished what time alone had not. The tower had collapsed, its stones tumbled into the sea. The entrance to the cave beneath, which Dunning described in his journal, had been sealed by the same collapse, buried under tons of rubble. Mrs. Pardew, when I called upon her, was reluctant to discuss Dunning's stay or his investigations. She would say only that he had been a good man who looked too deeply into dark waters. When I asked whether she believed the phenomena he described had been genuine, she gave me a long look. "I believe that some places remember," she said finally. "Remember what was done there, what was promised, what watches were kept, and what compacts were made. I believe that Wraith's Point is such a place, and that it will not release those who draw its attention until they fulfill what it demands of them." "And what does it demand?" "Watchers," she said simply. "Keepers. Someone to tend the light between the worlds, to observe what moves in the deep places, to maintain the old ways." Mr. Dunning saw the need, but refused the obligation, and so the obligation followed him. Will follow him, I suspect, even beyond death. I asked whether she thought the lighthouse might be rebuilt. The watch resumed. She shook her head. "The Trinity House Board has no plans for that. They say the location is too dangerous, too prone to erosion. But I think they know, as men have always known, that some lights are better left unlit. Some watches are better left unmaintained. The old compact is broken now. If it ever truly existed, what lives in the deep water beneath the point will keep to itself, or it won't. But there'll be no more keepers standing between." And Dunning. Mr. Dunning made his choice. He looked into the light and turned away. Whether he can ever truly escape it, she left the thought unfinished. I walked out to the headland on my final day in Kingsmouth. The ruins of the lighthouse were barely recognizable, just a scatter of workstone blocks among the natural rock, already being reclaimed by lichen and moss. The carved pillars that had stood at the base were gone, cast down, or buried. The seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries lonely in the cold spring air. I descended the cliff path to the cave entrance Dunning had described, but found it utterly blocked by the collapsed tower stones. No light penetrated that darkness. Now, no sound emerged, save the crash of waves against the rock. Whatever had been there, whatever Dunning had seen in that subterranean chamber, was sealed away, for now at least. As I climbed back to the headland path, I paused to rest, and looked back at the wreckage of the tower, and I confess that for a moment, no more than an instant, I thought I saw something among the ruins. A tall figure, stooped, indistinct, in the afternoon haze, standing as if on watch. But when I looked directly, there was nothing, only stone and sea and the wheeling gulls. I left Kingsmouth that evening and have not returned. The Society received my report on Dunning's investigation, though I omitted certain details that seemed too fantastic for scholarly publication. His death was noted in our proceedings, attributed to accidental drowning, and his contributions to the study of coastal fortifications were duly acknowledged. But I kept his journal, and I keep it still, in a locked drawer in my study, alongside the photograph Mrs. Pardew gave me, the one showing Arthur Gulliver and his fellow keepers, with that shadowed figure visible in the lighthouse window behind them. Sometimes, in the deep hours of night, when sleep eludes me, I take out these relics and study them by lamplight. I examine Dunning's increasingly frantic notations. I study the faces of the keepers in that old photograph, and I try to convince myself that what Dunning encountered was explicable, some conjunction of natural phenomena and overwrought imagination, producing effects that merely appeared supernatural. I am not always successful in this self-persuasion, for I have learned in the years since Dunning's death of other incidents, other men who ventured to isolated lighthouses and returned changed, or did not return at all. Other structures that stood in places where sea met land, where old things lingered, and ancient compacts bound the living to the dead. The documented cases are rare, and the reports are often dismissed as folklore or madness. But they exist, they persist. And late at night, when fog rolls in from the sea, and the wind carries strange sounds and stranger silences, I sometimes hear it faint and far away, but unmistakable, the tolling of a bell where no bell should be. 12 strokes, slow and measured, marking an hour that exists only in the liminal spaces between worlds. On such nights, I lock my study door and keep all lamps burning until dawn, for I have learned what Philip Dunning learned, what Arthur Gulliver learned before him, that there are things in this world that are not content to remain glimpsed and half forgotten, things that, once they have fixed their attention upon you, do not easily release their claim. The watch must be kept, the old keeper's letter said, and I have come to fear, in my darkest moments, what that really means. Not that someone must keep watch at places like Wraith's Point, but that the watch itself keeps us, that those who see too deeply into those dark waters become themselves part of what they observe, trapped forever in a cycle of watching and waiting, tending lights that exist between life and death, sea and sky, the world we know and the world that presses against it from the other side. Philip Dunning refused the call. He turned his back on the light and fled into what he thought was safety. But in the end, the deep water claimed him anyway, filled his lungs with its impossible salt, and drew him down into whatever service he had tried to escape. I pray I may be spared such a fate. I pray that my second-hand knowledge, my academic distance from these events, will be sufficient to protect me from the attention of what keeps watch in such places. But prayer, I have learned, is cold comfort when the fog comes in and the bell begins to toll, and you hear, as I have heard, God help me, more than once, slow footsteps on the stairs outside your study, and a wet hand upon the door handle, testing the lock with patient, implacable persistence. The lighthouse at Wraith's Point is gone, but the watch continues, and somewhere in the spaces between sleep and waking, between sea and shore, between life and whatever comes after, the keepers tend their lights still, calling to others who might see too clearly and understand too well. May they never call to you. Edmund Cathcart died in his sleep on the night of January 15th, 1906. He was found in his study at Cambridge, seated at his desk with this manuscript open before him. The physician who attended determined that death was due to cardiac failure, though he noted certain anomalies. The deceased's clothes and the papers on his desk were damp, as if splashed with water, and there was a strong odor of brine in the study, despite the room being 3 stories above ground and some 80 miles from the sea. The manuscript you have just read was among Cathcart's papers, along with Philip Dunning's original journal and the photograph of Arthur Gulliver. These items came into my possession as Cathcart's literary executor, with instructions that they be preserved, but not necessarily published, as he felt the account might prove too disturbing for general readership. I have wrestled with this charge for some years now, uncertain whether the public interest is best served by suppression or disclosure. In the end, I have chosen to make this account available, on the theory that knowledge, even knowledge, of disturbing matters is preferable to ignorance. I can verify that the lighthouse at Wraith's Point was indeed destroyed in the winter of 1903 to 1904, and that its ruins are now entirely submerged at high tide. I can verify that Philip Dunning died under circumstances that were, by any objective measure, inexplicable, and I can verify that Edmund Cathcart, a man of impeccable scholarly credentials and unimpeachable rationality, believed the events described in this narrative to be genuine. Whether they were genuine, whether the supernatural phenomena reported by Dunning and feared by Cathcart have any objective reality, I cannot say. I am an editor and bibliographer, not a philosopher or a theologian. I can only present the evidence and allow the reader to draw their own conclusions. I will note, however, certain facts that may or may not be relevant. The site of the Wraith's Point Lighthouse has never been redeveloped. Trinity House made no attempt to rebuild after the collapse, and the headland remains unoccupied. Local fishing boats give the point a wide berth, particularly on foggy nights. There have been no drownings in the immediate vicinity since 1904, though this may simply reflect the absence of any structure there to attract visitors. Lights have been reported at the point on several occasions over the past decade, usually described as cold, blue, and phosphorescent. The Coast Guard has investigated these reports twice and found no explanation, attributing them to unusual atmospheric conditions or reflected moonlight. And I will admit, though with some reluctance, that during my own visit to Kingsmouth last autumn, made purely for the purpose of verifying certain details in Cathcart's account, I experienced something I cannot easily explain. It was evening, and I had walked out to view the ruins of the lighthouse from the cliff path. The fog was coming in. As I stood there, and the light was fading, I heard quite distinctly the sound of a bell tolling 12 slow strokes. I asked my companion, a local man who had agreed to guide me, whether there was a bell buoy in the area. He looked at me strangely. "No bell buoy," he said. "Nothing out here but the old tower, and that's been silent for years." Then, after a pause, "You heard it then?" I confessed that I had. "Best not linger," he said, and began walking back toward the village with some urgency. I followed, glancing back only once. The fog had swallowed the headland entirely, but through that white opacity I glimpsed, or thought I glimpsed, a point of light, cold and blue, burning where the lighthouse lantern room had once stood. I did not mention this to my companion. I have not mentioned it to anyone until now, recording it here as a kind of confession, or perhaps as a warning. For I find that I think of that light often. I dream of it sometimes, a cold beacon calling across fog and darkness, tended by figures that are no longer entirely human, kept burning by a compulsion that transcends death itself. And I wonder, in those dreams, whether the light calls to me, whether I, like Dunning and Cathcart before me, have drawn the attention of whatever keeps watch at Wraith's Point. So far, I have heard no footsteps on my stairs. I have seen no dripping figures reflected in my windows. My sleep, though troubled, remains my own. But the fog comes often in autumn and winter, rolling in from the Thames, and on such nights I find myself listening for the sound of a bell, tolling 12 slow strokes, and watching my door with an attention that is perhaps not entirely rational, but which I cannot seem to relinquish. The manuscript is published now. The account is complete, and if there are others who have seen the light at Wraith's Point, who have heard the bell that should not ring, who have felt the pull of that dark water, and the compulsion of that endless watch, perhaps they will read these pages and understand that they are not alone in their knowledge or their fear. And perhaps, though I dare not hope for this, perhaps By sharing this burden of knowledge, we may somehow lessen its weight. Perhaps by naming what haunts us, we may rob it of some portion of its power. Or perhaps, as I increasingly suspect, such hope is futile. Perhaps some lights, once seen, can never be forgotten. Some calls, once heard, must eventually be answered. Some watches, once glimpsed, draw the observer inexorably inward, until watcher and watched become indistinguishable, and a line between duty and damnation blurs beyond all recognition. I do not know. I can only wait and watch and hope that when the fog comes tonight, as I know it will, the door will hold against whatever tests its lock with wet and patient hands. May God have mercy on us all. J. Henderson, F.S.A. London, November 1911. The lighthouse at Wraith's Point was never rebuilt. The site remains unoccupied, but on certain nights, particularly when fog rolls in from the North Sea, residents of Kingsmouth report seeing a light on the headland, cold, blue, and persistent. Trinity House maintains that no navigational beacon exists at that location. The residents do not dispute this. They only suggest that not all lights serve to guide the living. Some lights, they say, mark boundaries between worlds. Some lights summon rather than warn, and some lights once lit can never truly be extinguished, not by storm or time or the most determined efforts of rational men. The reader may believe this or not, as they choose. But if ever you walk the Norfolk coast on a foggy night, and you see ahead of you a light that burns where no light should be, I counsel you, turn away. Do not investigate. Do not seek to understand. For the watch at Wraith's Point continues still, and it is always looking for new keepers.